You want the best for your car? You already watch our tutorials.
So the best place for the best deal is to buy from the Mr. Auto app. Easy, fast, and with better prices than on the website.
You will find the bulk shock absorbers used in the video exclusively on the Mr. Auto website and through the link in the description. Turn your engine off. Pull up the handbrake. Pull on the bonnet release lever and open the bonnet. In order to change the front shock absorbers on your vehicle, you must lift the front of the car and remove the wheels to have complete access to the suspension system. Loosen the stud bolts on the front wheels. Raise the front of the vehicle and put it in the two-axle stands. We strongly suggest watching the tutorial, raising your vehicle safely before carrying out this step. You will then be able to take off the wheels. Don't forget to slide them under the vehicle. To disassemble the front shock absorbers, it is first important to remove the windscreen frame and the windscreen wiper. Before removing the windscreen wipers, place adhesive tape in order to keep a precise indication of their location at the end position. This will make it possible to correctly position them when reassembling. Using a 13mm spanner, release the holding nut on the windscreen wipers. Remove the wiper arm by making slight movements up and down. If it doesn't come easily, we recommend using a car wiper arm puller to make the task a little easier. Remove the various different rivets that hold the upper part of the windscreen bay in place by lifting the central parts and pulling up. Remove the hose for the windscreen washing liquid. Take out the waterproofing joint on the windscreen bay by pulling it upwards from one end to the other. Now, remove the windshield frame. You now have to remove the metallic frame. Using a socket wrench, an extender, and a 10mm socket, remove the holding screws on the metallic bay and on the wiper motor. To access the last screw, remove the motor and disconnect it. Unscrew the last screw. Then move the bay. You can now access the heads of your car's shock absorbers. Using an 18mm spanner, a socket wrench and a Torx T40 socket, unscrew the lock nut on the head of the shock absorber a little. This will then enable you to loosen the shock absorbers a little for the next movements. Remove the ABS sensor cable. Brush the holding base on the brake hose as well as on the nut on the screw found on the bottom of the shock absorber. These elements can often get jammed, so use a penetrating oil to facilitate the operation. Using a socket wrench and a 14mm socket, unscrew the holding base on the brake hose. Then remove it. Using a socket wrench and a 17mm socket, unscrew the lug nut on the foot of the shock absorber. You can use a snap ring to help you remove it. Using a hammer and a chisel, release the hub lock nut. To unscrew the hub lock nut, you have to stop the disc rotating. To do this, insert a thin flathead screwdriver between the two sides of the disc. We recommend screwing the stud bolt back onto the wheel to avoid breaking the holding screw on the disc. With an iron bar and a 32mm socket, unscrew the nut on the hub, then remove it. Remove the key on the castellated nut and the control arm ball joint with a flathead screwdriver. Then unscrew the nut using a 90mm spanner. Using a ball joint puller, separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle. Using a crowbar, lever off the control arm from the steering knuckle. You can now remove the gimbal from the steering knuckle. Using a hammer, slide a thin chisel into the opening of the steering knuckle. This will slightly separate it and help remove the shock absorber. Lightly tap the steering knuckle to free the bottom of the shock absorber. Prepare a stable, elevated surface to place all of the steering knuckle once it's free. Finish unscrewing the lug nut from the top of the shock absorber. Hold the shock absorber with one hand while finishing the unscrewing with the other one. Put the shock absorber to the side.
Please support us. Subscribe and like the video, that will be really cool.
In order to change the shock absorber, you must now separate it from the spring. You can find a description of the tool used in the video, which we think is most adapted to the operation. Careful, pay attention as you compress the spring. This is not without risk and should be undertaken paying very careful attention. Install the shock absorber on the tool, then tighten the mobile flange against the spring, controlling its position carefully. Once the shock absorber is outside of the spring, you can remove the lower suspension strut support bearing. Use a 70mm offset wrench and a Torx T40 socket to unscrew the nut on the shock absorber stem. Finally, remove the other elements. Remove the shock absorber from the spring, then remove the stop plate. When changing the shock absorbers, you can also change the shock absorber strut support bearing, as well as the shock absorber stop and its protective sleeve. You can also reuse them if they're not too worn down. Take the new shock absorber. Push on the actuator to remove the security lock. You need to pump several times on the actuator to get the system going. Put the stop plate in place. Position everything in the spring. Pay careful attention to place the bottom of the spring so that it supports the shock absorber flange. Then install the protective sleeve, the upper shock absorber support, the turning stop plate, and finish by screwing on the lug nut onto the shock absorber stem. Firmly tighten. Unscrew the spring compression tool, paying attention to the position of the spring on the lower shock absorber support. Put the lower suspension strut support bearing. You have now finished preparing the new part. Start by putting the shock absorber in place. Put the upper strut support bearing back in. Then screw the head of the shock absorber back in, starting the process by hand. Sand and grease the inside of the steering knuckle to help facilitate the reinsertion of the shock absorber. Grease the outside of the gimbal that you will start sliding into the steering knuckle before putting in the foot of the shock absorber back in. You can use a hammer to help you, making slight taps until you reach the metallic plate stop, which is at the same level as the opening of the steering knuckle at the foot of the shock absorber. You can now remove the metal chisel. Screw the screen at the foot of the shock absorber back in. Finish off the tightening with a torque wrench. Screw the holding base on the brake hose back in. Clip the ABS sensor hose back on. Screw the screw at the foot of the shock absorber back in. Take the new key and put it in place on the castellated nut. Fold the key using pliers. Now you can put the flange back on the hub. Finish off the tightening with a Torx wrench. Reinsert it using a hammer and a chisel. Finish off screwing the nut on the shock absorber head. Finish off the tightening with a Torx wrench. Then put the metallic frame back in. Screw all the screws back in. Screw back in, then reconnect the windscreen wiper motor. Put the windshield frame back in place along with the plastic rivets. Reconnect the hose for the windscreen washing liquid. Put the waterproof joint back on, then the windscreen wiper arms without tightening excessively. Then you will be able to put the wheels back on your vehicle, putting it back on the ground. Operation completed.
Hello, if this video helped you, like and subscribe.